Interesting, very helpful. Chair, back to you.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. Chris Loder, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for popping out just.
No, not at all. I was briefer than you would have expected.
Yeah. Good morning, both of you. It's good to see you here. Could I just ask you both to start with, how would you briefly assess the department's process for prioritising BSIP funding from what you know of it? Peter, can I ask you first?
Yeah, very difficult to know. The only indication from the outset was that authorities needed to be ambitious, and that their BSIPs would be judged on ambition and quality. And beyond that, there was very little to work against, apart from obviously knowing what the objectives that had been set out in the National Bus Strategy set. In terms of feedback and the process, I think the process has developed and evolved over time, because the understanding from authorities from the outset was that there was going to be probably some funding for them all. It was said that there would be two tranches of funding. The first would be formula-based, so the expectation was that there was going to be at least something for each authority, based maybe on population, rurality or the like. And then there would be sort of further funding based on, I suppose, level of ambition of particular projects or schemes that would be funded and maybe require, we guess might require some sort of outline business case to justify those. Obviously, as time changed, it became apparent that it was going to be more of a competitive bidding process, and that not all authorities would be funded. Then there was obviously discussions. Everyone knew that the DfT were having discussions with a number of authorities, and these were the ones sort of likely to receive some funding, and so again, some authorities started to see the realisation that they weren't going to. Okay. So I think it was an evolving process that no one was quite sure how it was going to end. And still, the unsuccessful authorities haven't had any feedback, of course.
Yeah, indeed. So, in terms of the lack of feedback. Are you aware of unsuccessful authorities being giving a time frame of when they can expect that?
Yeah, I heard you mention earlier, end of May, and they've been.
So that's what I've mentioned, but
I know of at least two authorities that have had that same message.
Lovely. Okay, wonderful. Linda, can I ask you the same question, please?
Very little to add, because I think Peter has covered it. However, I mean, it's been very difficult for those areas who have not received this first tranche of funding. I mentioned I chaired the board of the Norfolk Enhanced Partnership. Suffolk first sit on that board as well, and Norfolk got funding, Suffolk...
49 million you had, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
So Suffolk did not. And so when we're having those conversations, very aware that the MD of First in Suffolk is dealing with a very different situation to maybe Norfolk having received funding. However, hopefully this is just the beginning, and I think the feedback to those people who were not successful is extremely important. We have heard that there's going to be an officer allocated to each of those areas to help them maybe put forward stronger bids for the future.
You say from what you've seen so far that the process has been more in favour of urban areas rather than rural areas?
Not too sure I agree with that. I mean, Norfolk is quite a rural area. For instance, parts of the West Midlands, we have rural areas. It is a bit difficult to look and assess particularly why some areas got it over others. But as Peter mentioned, it was an evolving situation where at the beginning it did feel like everybody was going to get funding. That didn't come to pass. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things in all of this is that those areas who have got funding need to make darn sure that actually they're delivering what passengers want, and that we can measure and look at that so as to hold up good practice, and then open it up maybe to other areas.
I would say that there is that the process works against rural authorities because a lot of the requirements that they were putting forward were revenue based rather than capital.
Now, I'm pleased you mentioned this because you may have heard I asked earlier the split between capital and operating expenditure. Do you think that is a inherent flaw in the process, that more rural areas maybe require a different balance on the capex, OPEX, than maybe urban areas, and therefore have been disadvantaged by it?
I think they have, but again, of course, there was no guidance given. At the outset, it was suggested that the overall 3 billion funding for the National Bus strategy would be sort of a mix of revenue and capital, maybe 50-50 was the sort of indication given.
It appears, though, that those that are more heavily weighted towards capital expenditure have been more successful.
I believe that to be the case.
Councillor Renard, could I just ask you the same questions, if I may? First of all, do you believe the system has sort of not really been in the favour of rural areas, but maybe has been more so in urban areas?
Yeah, I agree with the comments of my fellow panel members. I think it is a really difficult question to answer. I think the overall point here is that this is a national bus strategy, and as we heard from Tony Page earlier on, the success of this is reliant on local authorities working with their near neighbours, because people, when they go about their business, are not considering whether they're crossing municipal borders or not. So it is really important that if we want to get people back onto buses across the whole country, that actually we do ensure that there is funding available to all local authorities in order to make the step change that we all want to see.
Do you believe, David, that actually it would have been better if local authorities had grouped together to put a bid collectively forward? So in my case, say Dorset, Somerset and Wiltshire, rather than just Dorset or Wiltshire or Somerset on their own?
Well, if those opportunities are made available by government, then local authorities, as you heard from Tony earlier on, are very keen to collaborate with their immediate neighbours. And if that gives a greater chance of success with bids, then I think you'll find that local authorities are willing to do that. But the issue does come back to some extent, I think, around the bidding that I referred to earlier on. Local authorities are having to spend a lot of money to bid with no guarantee of success, and it is a costly exercise, and it's perhaps not the best use of public money.
Are you of the view, David, that the DFT has been geared up adequately to cope with this process?
Again, I think that's very difficult to judge, but and we're not aware of why the original 3 billion announcement was then scaled back later to 1.2 billion. So a number of these decisions, I think, are a bit opaque, and a better understanding for all of us would be very helpful.
And am I right in saying that it is your understanding that what was perceived, or where there was perceived to be a second tranche opportunity of funding, that is no longer the case?
Well, we very much hope it will be the case, but again, we don't know. So I would say.
So therefore, your level of confidence that is available is reasonably low at this time. Is that?
I think that's a fair comment.
Yeah, thank you. Linda, could I ask you the same question about that in terms of the second tranche? Is it also your understanding that there's no real certainty at this stage on second tranche funding being available?
So certainly not aware of definite funding, but again, would greatly hope there is, because while we're hugely grateful for the funding that has been put into our buses, there hasn't been this type of funding for many years, if ever. It certainly has not and is not going to benefit the whole country in this first tranche, so therefore we would want to be seeing a lot more, because it should be benefiting bus users and encouraging non-bus users across the country.
Indeed.
Not just some areas.
Yeah, okay. Peter?
I think that local authorities hope that there will be further, but I don't think they're sort of holding the breath for that. The ones that were unsuccessful in their letters saying that they were unsuccessful, I think there was some wording about that said this is a no but not a no for good sort of thing. There may be some further funding opportunities in the future. And so obviously local authorities would like to think that is the case, and all the authorities that we're working with and supporting are continuing with their partnerships, with their enhanced partnerships, and developing their schemes in the hope that there will be those further opportunities.
Are you of the view that the work so far has set a very clear expectation across the country that they are likely to benefit, regardless of the area, likely to benefit from this strategy, but actually when it comes down to it, there actually have been much fewer benefits? I think it was it 31 out of 79 council bids actually benefited in the end. Yeah,
I mean there was a huge buzz around the initial introduction of the National Bus Strategy. It really enthused people, I think, because obviously the times we've been going through, bus usage had been declining, and we finally felt that here was government really giving bus a really big push. There was a lot in the news, there was a lot of talk about buses. It was great for the industry, and I think the public actually sort of saw that and recognised that. However, of course, public might have quite short memories as to what's been going on over the last year. Obviously, it's at the forefront of what local authorities have been thinking about.
So,
but
could I just say, a lot of councils, particularly those who are less experienced in this field, will have engaged consultants to help them with their bids. This is a process that has not really been undertaken before, certainly not in any recent times. Do you have any views as to whether or not there may or may not be a competency issue on some of the consultancies who may have sold themselves to be extremely good, that they can maybe achieve brilliant, rail bids or whatever other bids there may have been, but actually in this field they're less experienced, and that may have had an impact on the success of the client of which they were working for?
I'm sure that wasn't a reference to yourself.
I was going to say it's an interesting question
just to be clear, it certainly wasn't. But because
it might be a tough one for you to answer on the basis that you might be dobbing in your.
Yeah, well,
I feel it's not appropriate. I'm sure we can.
You can always put it to.
I'll ask Councillor Renner that question in a minute.
I'm happy to say something on that. I mean, I can't answer for how all local authorities did sort of get consultants on board. Many authorities, particularly larger authorities, already have frameworks with transport consultancies, and they may well have just been forced to engage with those.
Just come back to the question.
Yeah.
Do you have any views that you can share as to whether or not the consultancy capability across the board will have affected some of the bids that may have gone in?
I would say no, because I think many authorities won't have just left it to a consultancy to work through this process. Certainly with all ours, we were there working alongside local authority officers to help with that capacity.
Okay, thank you. Linda, could I ask you that question?
You can, but I
have a view.
I really don't. It's not
fine.
something that transport
that's fine, thank you. David, do you have a view on, as to whether that may or may not be the case?
The LGA wouldn't have a particular view on this. It is a matter for each local authority to take a view on whether they wish to bid for any funding pot and to make that bid either themselves or with consultants of their choosing. So, no, I don't have a specific view on that.
No. In terms of the financial situation that a lot of rural areas are now faced with, particularly those who are not successful as a result or after the BSIP submissions, David, do you have any views as to how local authorities might be able to fund better bus services in a different way?
Well, this is going to be a real challenge because, as we know, the vast majority of bus services around the country are run on a commercial basis. unless they're specifically tendered for and subsidised by the local authorities. And local authorities' funding for subsidising services has decreased quite significantly over the last 10 or so years.
And do you, are you of the view that as a result of that, some private sector operators position themselves, for example, to suggest publicly that a bus route may not be viable in order to put the local authority in a place where they either have to subsidise the route or say it requires subsidising, or it's basically removed?
That may well have happened on various routes and in various authorities across the country, and yes, it does put local authorities in a very difficult position as to whether they can. And
would you say that's improper of commercial operators to take advantage in that way? Because what it's really doing, isn't it, is pushing the risk onto local authorities rather than, you know, on one hand, you can take the commercial benefit from operating a route, but when, of course, it becomes a little bit more difficult, that they're expecting the local authority to take the hit, if indeed there really is one.
Clearly it's not a strategy that I would support or welcome, and if that is going on, then clearly we would appreciate any support in
indeed.
Urging the bus companies to change their approach if that's what they're doing.
Thank you. Linda, I wondered if you have a view as to that sort of thing happening in the industry, or if you are aware of it maybe happening in places.
So I'm not aware of it happening or really have a view particularly on that point, but what I do have a strong view on is that passengers and people don't care who's running their buses. What they want are good, punctual, reliable services. And if there is any of that going on, then that's not of benefit to the end user. And therefore we should be working together to
But does your organisation seek to expose that sort of thing, should it happen, or do you think that's not really your...
No, we're about getting the views of passengers and making sure things are improved.
Okay. My next question, conscious I'm probably going to get a glare shortly if I'm not getting it already. I asked the earlier panel about the impact of bus passes and how they reduce the commercial viability of some routes. And in areas such as Dorset that has a particularly high average demographic, that makes the commercial bus routes much less viable. David, I wondered if I could ask you first as to whether or not you see this as a real issue across the country, particularly in rural areas.
Absolutely, this is one of the key issues, and the LGA's been lobbying government on this for a number of years now, ever since the concessionary fares scheme was introduced. It has been consistently underfunded. Sorry
to interrupt, but do you believe that the government has actually listened to those petitions or not?
As we haven't seen any change in policy, I would have to say not, because we believe there is around about a £700 million gap between the amount that's paid to bus companies and the amount that local authorities receive from government. It has been reported to this committee previously, I believe in 2019. So it continues to be a real issue in terms of being able to fund services regardless of whether they're rural or urban.
Thank you. And could I just ask you both, Linda first, do you have a view as to how the concessionary passes affect the commercial viability, particularly of rural buses?
I think it's obviously going to have an impact. I was at a conference in Dublin fairly recently where the policy was to fund concessionary fares, and somebody asked, well, why aren't you funding young people? And the answer was it should be both. And that is the case. There is a need to ensure that those with concessionary passes and of a certain age or with a disability or whatever should be able to get good bus services and indeed subsidy if that is required, but also for other people. So I think a fundamental view and looking at ensuring that we're delivering for all passengers, not just certain groups.
Thank you. Peter, very briefly, do you have an observation to share?
Just, I think in the past there have been concerns from operators, but actually in the present circumstances, I think because concession usage is so low, operators would be pleased to see any sort of additional use of.
Well, it may be low in some areas, but those where the average demographic is high, it is actually in many cases, it is the deciding factor as to whether or not a commercial operator or commercial operation is viable or not. Would you agree?
It can be, because obviously they will only get a percentage of the revenue loss.
I don't suppose you know what percentage it is.
It varies because it is set in individual concessionary fare schemes that agreed with the authorities to with their operators, and it might vary on the type of operations, but it can be that operators receive maybe only 50% of the fare foregone.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to you.
Chris, thanks ever so much.